So I'm Marian, and as you've seen, I did my thesis on early Rome, 4th century. I'm now working with Helm and Sophia in Münster on the surrounding Gulf region, and it is my pleasure to give the response to this panel here. And massively enjoyed all of it, but like Sophia, I would like to first thank the organizers for several things, actually. First, for inviting us to Scotland and St. Andrews. Great and beautiful countryside and also good beers. Thank you very much. Secondly, for a really stimulating conference so far, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow. And thirdly, for your energy in engaging and promoting environmental studies through this conference and through your local research center and your work. And I really mean this. I mentioned this before. I really mean this. We are faced with ecological disasters, from firestorms to species extinctions, temperatures exceeding human and animal limits this summer in India, water shortage in Central Europe, which I've not known so far. So the list goes on, and there can be little doubt that this is the existential challenge of our generation. And I'm afraid it's a challenge that our generation has to master, because the next one will not have the chance, or might not have the chance. So, in a nutshell, I've very much enjoyed your introduction today, Ruben, on what we can do to contribute to a greater awareness and imagination of alternative futures that can help along and maybe also trigger a bit social transformations. And my Dr. Vater used to say that we, as ancient historians, had to save the world. And I was always a bit skeptical. Of our abilities in this regard. But this project of yours here is probably closer to explain than anything else that I've seen so far. So I would really encourage you to go on with it. And yeah, I'm absolutely on board. It's a pleasure to be able to join today's conversation by commenting on the excellent papers that we've just heard on the Italian city-states and the environment. Overall, I think it is fair to say that individually and in combination, and you pointed it out earlier, the past 4 presentations have really meshed well and have provided us with plenty of fodder for further thoughts on the diverse but overall cohesive arguments on the interrelations between environmental changes and urbanization have, in my opinion, convincingly demonstrated the feasibility and the need to give more room to the integration of environmental studies into our reconstructions of pre-Roman and Roman Italy. And I would also like to draw attention to the fact that not all academic cultures are at the same level here. So I think it's also important to connect these conversations. So now, I'm not an archaeologist, so I will not take you on a tour of the many interesting facets of the material presented here. Instead, I would like to briefly revisit the papers to zero in on a few central arguments as well as overarching themes pervading the 4 talks we've just heard. If you don't mind, I would also like to add a thought here and there of my own. So let's jump back to roughly 2 p.m. and Seth Bernard's presentation on environment and early urban society in Etruria. The central point here was a greater attention to variations in climatic patterns that demonstrated the prevalence of a relatively mild and wet climate period in the 8th to 6th century in Italy, thus creating favorable conditions, favorable background to the demographic growth and subsequent emergence and development of central urban places in Etruria around this time. What is interesting in this context, or what I found interesting, is the pace and the path of the developments that you've outlined. The end of the golden climate years led to activities that aimed at safeguarding the urban communities in the face of changing conditions, and you specifically singled out adaptations and improvements in regard to resilience strategies, improved water management and food storage. Furthermore, I think you also argued for greater attention to multilinearity, to acknowledge the range of reactions, the broad range of reactions and paths taken in different regions by different communities. And I thought that was a point well made. In this regard, we might also want to consider paying greater attention to nonlinear processes and outcomes, to failures reorientations, what happens in places where these resilience strategies don't work. So I think we are too much focused on success here. And by taking nonlinear processes and outcomes into account, I think we would also include a necessary counterweight to those grand narratives of linear developments. And this question also popped up in regard to Peter Attema's and Angela's talk, who also discussed resilience strategies in their presentations on salt production and animal husbandry. And as the title suggested, and as we've seen, those have really meshed well in salt and animal husbandry. That just goes together well. They also both followed up on the previous paper by Seth, because they made a strong argument, a very convincing argument, that the evidence for increased production was a result of the demographic growth that you had described before. So demand and production increased as a response to that demographic growth. So again, meshed very well. So as we've heard in the second and third talk, salt was indispensable to human consumption, but also essential for animal husbandry, the production of dairy products, and food preservation. And according to Angela, that intensification was driven up by the demand. And as I've already mentioned, she also pointed out to the pigs, right? She pointed out the pigs and the great increase in that, which might also lead us to a different perspective on some of the social developments at this time. I got a bit ahead of myself there earlier. But it also connects a bit to your argument earlier when you asked, where is this meat coming from? And Angela showed that those pigs were usually located in close proximity to sanctuaries. So what we've seen in those talks was an intensification of interactions, first of production, but also of interactions and linkages between urban spaces and agricultural production in the countryside, because herds move, as we've seen, right? The pigs come back into the city at some point. So that's also interesting, these changing levels of interaction. And they also become apparent in the context of salt production, I thought. As Peter has shown, the fact that salt was mainly won in coastal salt works that required both technological as well as organizational skill to be run on a grand scale, also had consequences on the exchange between regions. Simply put, salt was produced in one side, but consumed in many others. So there again, this connection between demand and supply interconnected different areas in Italy. And I think the Tiber Valley, you mentioned that would be another example. We've already mentioned the Via Salaria and the Feriae Latinae would be another interesting point, where we have a festival binding in all the different communities. And also, I mean, the evidence we have is late, but dairy products figure prominently in those cultic, in those festivities, in this festival. In this context, we should also keep in mind that the exploitation and value of the resources that we've just talked about also created ample opportunities for conflict. Peter pointed to the maybe most famous case between Veii and Rome, struggling for control of its salt pans. And to this, I would also like to add that the increased production must have also placed tensions on communities internally. We've heard about the legislation earlier, legislation against grazers, but there's also this recurring topic of land distribution, or the demand for land distribution. So I think that we should also take that argument on winners and losers to the internal level of the communities here in this regard. Overall, both papers stress the driving forces and the gravitational pull that urban centers exerted in regard to the exploitation of resources in the countryside. And combined with Seth papers, I thought that the knock-on effects of the interactions between the growing urban settlements and their environments were highlighted quite nicely, resulting in an intensified exploitation and reshaping of certain areas, but also of certain central place services and institutions. If you have a lot of Animals, all of a sudden, you also, I imagine, need a lot of people that are able to butcher them. And this changed the outlook of the city. Just referring to Amy Russell's great book, who showed that the Forum Romanum was actually an everyday marketplace to the 2nd century. I mean, huge transformations in the 2nd century, but then really a meeting point, a market where you would not just go to participate in the political activities, but also in the economic activities. Overall, we gradually moved from the overall climatic environment to the level of regional interactions and interdependencies throughout the first 3 talks. And Andrea then took us to the local level with her presentation on the Tiber Valley and the various changes appearing there in the 6th century. Again, I thought that the presentation in a way mirrored Seth's, but in the paper he also said that the big difference in the Tiber Valley is that it happens so fast, the change, within 1 generation, so people can really see that something is happening and they need to change something. Maybe the main problem with the current issue of climate change, that, I mean, I grew up with it, but how bad can it be? But within 1 generation, that seems like the contemporaries would have noticed that something's wrong and had to be done. So I saw the similarities and the differences there, and I don't think I need to repeat what you said earlier on the significant investments. I mean, we still have the talk in front of us, I think, but I would like to point out that, again, those processes of mobilizing workers and resources that went into the dredging really compare in a way with the building projects that John Hopkins has discussed for pre-Republican Rome, and for which he stresses that the communal effort required central planning and that a lot of people were involved, and that it maybe diversified the power structures as well. However, and I've said this before, I believe that your work on the Tiber Valley has been crucial and will help us immensely. But as I already mentioned, I also noted that you carefully stressed the importance of the elites, and I was happy that you had the Res Publica there, and I think we can just see that as also a symbol for the citizenship community. I think that is the point that I really want to stress here. So, however, our interpretations differ, but however we want to interpret these processes, it is clear that they played out, all of them, in increasingly defined and fixed locales, and were conducted by a growing number of local specialists and laborers, from salt workers to teamsters, whose cooperation in these activities, as well as their reliance on shared central services, again, cultics festivals or economic activities in the firm, are likely to have formed some form of local practices and identities. And the importance of these specialists for the respective communities makes it likely that they could also exert political influence. And I will bring just one example, the Centurie Fabrum in the Comitia Centuriata. I mean, these specialists really have their own say, their own centuries in this, their own centuria in this most important Roman assembly. So, I mean, you've already found out, but I will nevertheless, just in case, confess that I'm approaching the talks we have heard so far from an early to mid-Republican Roman perspective, and I am clearly tempted to connect many of these processes to what I've worked on in the 4th century. And again, interpretations may differ, but I honestly believe that these exciting and challenging discussions are something that we have to have right now. And I think early Roman Republic is at a really exciting stage now. I mean, we're reinterpreting basically everything. So regardless of my personal preferences, the papers, and by extension, the environmental studies here, have definitely recommended themselves by the simple fact that they have shed greater light on a period that is still characterized by a lot of question marks, adding more pieces to the puzzle, so to speak. In contrast to the environment, I mean, coming back to the title of the conference, in contrast to the environment, we have talked precious little about the city-state. And we have overall operated with a rather static and specific idea of the city-state that fits the archaic period. But I think we were getting into more problems in the classical period and also mid-Republican Rome, maybe even already in the 4th century. I suspect that this is due to the fact that this avoids the issue of great power city-states and alliances, which were able to bring very different capabilities and resources to bear. But it's something that I noticed throughout all the talks. So I would definitely agree with Anton, who said that earlier, that we need to have a more integrated, but also more dynamic model that maybe goes through the centuries more than focusing on this archaic period. And last, I promise you, this is going to be one of the last points. Lastly, this point is also connected to the most obvious and most exceptional environmental feature in which all of the aforementioned actions took place, the Mediterranean Sea itself, and it's been mentioned a couple of times here. And we're all familiar with the arguments regarding the high level of Mediterranean connectivity and the interlinked nature of many of its microregions. So I don't have to repeat this here. However, the corrupting sea does not account for the at times dramatic social-political changes that the ancient world and communities experienced at rather frequent intervals. And I think this is something where we can do more, and we're combining global Mediterranean processes with the great work that all of you have done here today, can really help us take a step forward. I mean, it's been 20 years, and I think it's time to move on a bit and reinterpret these things. And yeah, one argument for this is also another crucial debate in which ancient history should get involved. Citizenship in general. Last week we had a conference in Münster, comparative history, with sinologists. And sinologists pointed out that citizenship is not an automatic result of urbanization. It's rather the exception, what we're seeing in the Mediterranean. And because we are so focused on it, it's totally normal for us, especially because the European conquest then in modern times basically spreads citizenship throughout the world. But it's really something special. That's something that the sinologists kept saying during that conference. And we are just taking it for granted. And I think here, again, environmental studies, high connectivity, easy exchange, but also easy diffusion. You can get away pretty fast. Are points that we want to develop a bit more, explore a bit more. So, yeah, that's my last point here. And again, it's been a great conference, shedding light on a period where we still have so many question marks, but I think we can go even further into the time and maybe also engage the literary evidence. I would encourage us to work to move forward boldly here. And so, yeah, please keep going. And thanks for this wonderful conference. And thank you all for very exciting day.